Across every generation, a small group of Pokémon has stood apart through strength, adaptability, and reputation. This category, known as pseudo-legendary Pokémon, reflects a consistent approach to power across the series. Metagross occupies a unique place among pseudo-legendary Pokémon because its power is framed not as something ancient, instinctual, or mystical, but as something constructed, calculated, and relentlessly logical. While many Pokémon of similar status are described through myths, legends, or environmental dominance, Metagross is instead described as the result of deliberate design. Its existence suggests a world where intelligence itself can be engineered, combined, and refined into a living weapon. At its foundation, Metagross is not a singular mind. It is the fusion of four distinct units, each contributing to a shared consciousness. This alone sets it apart from nearly every other Pokémon. Where evolution usually represents growth or adaptation, Metagross represents convergence. Multiple beings becoming one does not just increase strength, it fundamentally alters how thought itself works. Instead of one perspective reacting to the world, Metagross processes information through parallel reasoning, allowing it to analyze, predict, and decide with extraordinary speed. This multi-mind structure is often described in terms of raw computational ability. Pokédex entries claim that Metagross can calculate faster than a supercomputer, but what makes this especially interesting is how that intelligence is applied. Metagross does not simply solve abstract problems. It uses prediction to dominate combat, anticipate movement, and exploit patterns long before opponents realize they are being analyzed. Battles against Metagross are often described as feeling unfair, not because of overwhelming force alone, but because every option seems anticipated in advance. Its Steel and Psychic typing reinforces this identity perfectly. Steel represents durability, permanence, and engineered resilience. Psychic represents intellect, foresight, and mental dominance. Together, these types create a Pokémon that feels less like a creature reacting to danger and more like a system executing solutions. Metagross does not panic, it does not hesitate, it evaluates. Metagross's physical design quietly supports this idea. Its body is symmetrical, rigid, and reinforced, with no unnecessary protrusions. The X-shaped structure across its face resembles both a brace and a crossroad, visually suggesting intersecting streams of data or decision-making paths. The red eyes embedded in this structure feel less expressive and more functional, as though they exist purely to observe and relay information rather than convey emotion. Despite its heavy, metallic body, Metagross is capable of hovering and rapid movement. This contradiction between weight and mobility is intentional. It reinforces the idea that Metagross is not bound by biological limitations in the same way as other Pokémon. Magnetic forces allow it to move with precision rather than brute force, giving it an eerie, almost effortless presence. When Metagross advances, it does not stomp or charge, it glides. Another important detail, often overlooked, is how Metagross's strength is not concentrated in a single attribute. It is not the fastest Pokémon, nor the strongest, nor the most durable. Instead, it performs exceptionally well across all categories. This balance reflects its core identity. Metagross does not rely on extremes. It relies on optimization. Its evolutionary line reinforces this theme in subtle ways. Beldum, its earliest form, communicates through magnetic pulses rather than speech or sound. This suggests that from the very beginning, Its species interacts with the world through signals and data rather than emotion. Beldam's behavior appears limited and repetitive, clinging to surfaces or floating aimlessly, but this simplicity hides potential rather than weakness. When Beldam evolves into Metang, two minds merge. This increases both physical capability and cognitive complexity. Metang is more coordinated, more deliberate, and more adaptable. By the time Metang evolves again, four minds unify into a single entity capable of advanced reasoning and autonomous decision-making. This progression suggests that Metagross's intelligence is not just large, but layered, built through accumulation rather than replacement. This concept of fusion through cooperation is rare in Pokémon evolution. Most Pokémon evolve individually, growing stronger on their own. Metagross evolves by becoming something greater than the sum of its parts. This quietly suggests a philosophy where unity and synchronization create power that cannot be achieved alone. Metagross's battle behavior reflects this philosophy clearly. It rarely overextends. It does not rely on emotional aggression or intimidation. Instead, it applies consistent pressure, forcing opponents into unfavorable positions before delivering decisive blows. Trainers facing Metagross often report feeling boxed in, as though every possible move has already been accounted for. Another subtle detail is how Metagross interacts with its environment. It is not described as territorial or destructive without purpose. Unlike Pokémon that reshape landscapes through sheer presence, Metagross tends to leave its surroundings intact unless alteration is strategically beneficial. This restraint reinforces the idea that Metagross values efficiency over dominance. Metagross's lack of visible emotion also contributes to its unsettling presence. Unlike Pokémon that roar, snarl, or display aggression, Metagross remains silent and expressionless. This silence makes it difficult to read intentions, adding psychological pressure to any encounter. When Metagross acts, it does so without warning or theatrics. There is also an interesting contrast between Metagross and other artificial or mechanical Pokémon. While some feel explicitly robotic, Metagross occupies a middle ground. It is not purely machine, nor purely organic. This ambiguity makes it more unsettling than either extreme. It thinks, but does not emote. It exists, but does not socialize. In competitive settings, Metagross has long been valued for its reliability. It rarely depends on luck or unpredictable mechanics. Instead, it performs consistently across situations, adapting to opponents rather than forcing specific outcomes. This reliability mirrors its lore. Metagross does not gamble, it calculates. Another detail often overlooked is how Metagross's weaknesses feel structural rather than accidental. Certain attack types exploit specific gaps in its design, suggesting intentional limitations rather than oversights. This reinforces the idea that Metagross was created with constraints, possibly to prevent it from becoming uncontrollable. Metagross's association with elite trainers and champions further reinforces its identity. It is often positioned as a final test, a Pokémon that represents mastery of strategy rather than brute force. Defeating Metagross feels less like overpowering an enemy and more like solving a problem under pressure. There is also a thematic layer to Metagross's existence that speaks to the broader Pokémon world. If Pokémon like Metagross can be engineered through fusion and design, then intelligence itself becomes a manipulable resource. This raises quiet questions about humanity's role in shaping Pokémon evolution and whether some forms of power are intentionally constructed rather than naturally occurring. Metagross's calm demeanor does not imply benevolence. It is not described as kind or cruel. It is described as effective, This neutrality makes it more intimidating than overt hostility. There is no anger to exploit, no pride to provoke. Its movements are precise, its strikes calculated, and its reactions immediate. Even when damaged, Metagross continues operating as long as functionality remains. Pain, in the traditional sense, does not seem to factor into its decision-making. Despite all this, Metagross is not portrayed as invincible. It can be defeated, it can be outmaneuvered, but doing so requires preparation, adaptability, and foresight. Metagross punishes recklessness more than it punishes weakness. This makes Metagross an ideal embodiment of a different kind of pseudo-legendary power. It is not about spectacle or fear. It is about inevitability through logic. When Metagross advances, it does so with the confidence of something that has already mapped the outcome. In a world filled with creatures driven by instinct, emotion, or myth, Metagross stands apart as something colder and more deliberate. It represents the idea that intelligence itself can become overwhelming when refined beyond restraint. And that is what makes Metagross so memorable. Not that it hits harder, flies faster, or endures longer than everything else, but that when it moves, it does so with certainty. Garchomp stands as one of the most consistently feared pseudo-legendary Pokémon, not because of spectacle or mystery, but because of how perfectly it embodies controlled aggression. Where many powerful Pokémon are framed through myth, rarity, or overwhelming presence, Garchomp is framed through motion. It is not a guardian, not a relic, not a construct. It is a predator, refined to near perfection. Garchomp is associated with speed in a way that feels almost unnatural for its size. It is repeatedly compared to jet aircraft, not only because of how fast it moves, but because of how it moves. Garchomp does not lumber or build momentum gradually. It accelerates instantly, covering vast distances before most opponents can react. This speed is not reckless. It is controlled, deliberate, and purposeful. Garchomp's design communicates this immediately. Its body is streamlined rather than bulky, with smooth contours and minimal excess mass. The fin-like structures on its arms and back are not decorative. They function as stabilizers, allowing it to maintain control at extreme velocities. Even its posture suggests readiness, leaning forward slightly, as if perpetually prepared to launch. One of the most overlooked details about Garchomp is how its ground and dragon typing shapes its identity. Ground types are often associated with stability, weight, and connection to terrain. Dragon types are associated with dominance, rarity, and raw power. Garchomp merges these ideas into something paradoxical. It is deeply connected to the earth, yet capable of leaving it behind at will. This duality defines how Garchomp fights. It is equally comfortable burrowing beneath the ground or cutting through the air at high speed. This versatility makes it difficult to predict. An opponent cannot assume distance provides safety, nor can they rely on terrain to slow it down. Garchomp's behavior reinforces this unpredictability. It is described as patrolling vast territories, covering enormous distances effortlessly. Unlike Pokémon that defend a single area, Garchomp operates on a much larger scale. This suggests confidence rather than caution. It does not fear intrusion. It expects to respond before threats escalate. Another important detail is how Garchomp uses its environment offensively. Rather than avoiding harsh terrain, it exploits it. Sandstorms, rocky landscapes, and uneven ground do not hinder Garchomp. They enhance it. Its movements become harder to track, its attacks more devastating, and its presence more overwhelming. Garchomp's evolutionary line also tells a story of refinement rather than transformation. Each stage builds directly toward its final form, without dramatic shifts in behavior or philosophy. This suggests that Garchomp's dominance is not a sudden emergence, but the result of gradual specialization. Unlike pseudo-legendaries that are framed as ancient or nearly extinct, Garchomp feels contemporary. It is not a remnant of a forgotten age. It is a product of ongoing adaptation. This makes it feel more dangerous because it is not bound by legend or tradition. It exists in the present, optimized for current conditions. Another subtle but significant detail lies in how Garchomp's senses are described. It is said to detect vibrations through the ground, allowing it to track prey even when visibility is limited. This ability makes escape nearly impossible once Garchomp commits to pursuit. Hiding, running, or standing still all become ineffective strategies. Garchomp's intelligence is often understated. It is not described as calculating in the same way as Metagross, but that does not imply simplicity. Instead, Garchomp exhibits situational intelligence. It adapts tactics mid-battle, responds to patterns, and adjusts pressure dynamically. It may not predict outcomes far in advance, but it reacts faster than most can think. This reactive intelligence pairs perfectly with its speed. Decisions do not need to be perfect if they are immediate. Garchomp thrives in chaos, turning disorder into opportunity. In battle, Garchomp rarely wastes movement. Every action serves a purpose. Even its defensive maneuvers are aggressive, forcing opponents into unfavorable positions. Retreat is often a setup for a counterattack rather than a sign of weakness. There is also a psychological component to facing Garchomp. Its reputation precedes it. Trainers often approach battles already anticipating defeat, which can lead to hesitation. Garchomp exploits this hesitation effortlessly. A moment of doubt is enough. Garchomp's design reinforces intimidation without exaggeration. It does not rely on excessive spikes, glowing features, or theatrical animations. Its threat comes from restraint. The less it moves, the more dangerous it feels, because motion signals inevitability. Another lesser-known aspect of Garchomp is how it balances offense and endurance. While often associated with speed, Garchomp is not fragile. Its physical resilience allows it to survive attacks that would cripple faster Pokémon. This durability ensures that even failed engagements rarely end its momentum. Garchomp's connection to sandstorms is particularly important. When conditions reduce visibility, Garchomp becomes nearly impossible to track. Its movements blend into the environment, making attacks feel sudden and unavoidable. This environmental synergy makes battles against it feel unfair rather than challenging. This sense of unfairness is key to Garchomp's legacy. It does not win through gimmicks or rare abilities. It wins by doing fundamental things better than almost anything else. Faster movement, stronger pressure, better positioning. Even among other pseudo-legendaries, Garchomp stands out for how consistently effective it is. There are no phases where it feels weak or transitional. From the moment it appears, it demands respect. Another important detail is how Garchomp is often depicted as solitary. It does not rely on packs or allies. This reinforces the idea that its strength is self-contained. Cooperation is unnecessary. This solitude also adds to its mystique. Encounters with Garchomp are rare, brief, and intense. It does not linger. It strikes and moves on. Garchomp's weaknesses are meaningful precisely because they are limited. Exploiting them requires preparation and precision. Mistakes are punished immediately. This high-risk dynamic makes every interaction with Garchomp tense. There is also a thematic element to Garchomp's design that mirrors natural predators. Efficiency over excess, speed over spectacle, adaptation over dominance. Garchomp does not need to prove its strength. It demonstrates it. In the broader Pokémon world, Garchomp represents evolution, refined through pressure rather than time. It is not ancient, it is honed. When Garchomp enters a battlefield, the tone shifts. Space becomes dangerous. Time feels compressed. Options disappear faster than they can be considered. It is not the loudest pseudo-legendary. It is not the flashiest. It is the one that ends battles before they truly begin. And that is why Garchomp remains one of the most respected, feared, and enduring forces in the Pokémon world. Salamance's story is one of longing, persistence, and eventual transformation, and it stands out among pseudo-legendary Pokémon because its power is rooted as much in desire as it is in strength. Where others are born powerful or engineered into dominance, Salamence earns its place through obsession. It is a Pokémon defined by wanting something so deeply that its body eventually changes to match that desire. The core of Salamance's identity lies in its relationship with the sky. Long before it ever gains the ability to fly, its earlier form is described as gazing upward constantly, watching birds and airborne Pokémon with fixation. This is not casual curiosity. It is envy, admiration, and determination combined into a single drive. Salamance's evolution is not just biological progression, but the fulfillment of a dream. This theme makes Salamence feel unusually personal. Many Pokémon evolve because of experience, battle, or exposure to certain conditions. Salamence evolves because it wants to. Its wings are not inherited casually. They are earned through years of desire and persistence, making its eventual flight feel like a reward rather than a given. When Salamence finally takes to the sky, it does so with overwhelming force. Pokédex entries describe it flying wildly, recklessly, and joyfully, often destroying terrain simply because it can. This behavior is not framed as cruelty, but as exuberance. Salamence flies not to dominate others, but because it has waited its entire life to do so. That joy, however, has consequences. Salamance's flight is described as dangerous, even to those around it. Villages are damaged, landscapes are altered. The same power that allows Salamence to live its dream also makes it a threat to anything nearby. This duality is central to its character. Fulfillment does not automatically bring control. Its dragon and flying typing reinforces this idea. Dragon represents immense, often uncontrollable power. Flying represents freedom, elevation, and escape. Together, they create a Pokémon whose strength is tied to liberation rather than conquest. Salamence does not seek to rule, it seeks to soar. Salamance's physical design supports this theme beautifully. Its massive wings dominate its silhouette, larger than seems strictly necessary. Its posture is forward-leaning, aggressive in motion but not inherently hostile. When grounded, Salamence looks restless, as though the earth itself is a temporary inconvenience. Another subtle detail is how Salamence behaves in battle. It is aggressive, but not calculated in the way Metagross is, nor precise like Garchomp. Salamence attacks with overwhelming force, often relying on brute strength and momentum. This reflects its lore. Salamence does not think its way through obstacles, it crashes through them. This makes Salamence incredibly dangerous, but also somewhat predictable. Once it commits to an attack, it rarely hesitates. Trainers facing Salamence often describe the experience as enduring a barrage rather than engaging in a duel. It overwhelms through presence. There is also a quiet sadness beneath Salamance's joy. Its desire to fly defines its entire life. Once that desire is fulfilled, what remains? Salamence continues to fly endlessly, almost compulsively, as though afraid that stopping would undo everything it worked for. This interpretation casts Salamence not as a triumphant figure, but as one trapped by its own dream. It wanted flight so badly that flight became its identity. There is no suggestion in its lore that Salamence ever rests contentedly on the ground. In contrast to pseudo-legendaries tied to balance or order, Salamence represents excess of desire. It did not evolve because it was necessary for survival. It evolved because it wanted more. This makes it relatable, but also cautionary. Salamance's reputation among trainers reflects this. It is admired, feared, and respected, but rarely described as calm or dependable. Handling Salamence requires strength, patience, and restraint. Without those, its power becomes a liability. Its weaknesses further reinforce this balance. Despite its immense power, Salamence has vulnerabilities that prepared opponents can exploit. This ensures that its dominance is never absolute, keeping it grounded within the world's rules. Another interesting aspect is how Salamence contrasts with Dragonite. Both are dragon-type pseudo-legendaries with flight, but their personalities are opposites. Where Dragonite is gentle and protective, Salamence is intense and destructive. This contrast suggests that flight, as a symbol, can represent different emotional outcomes depending on how it is achieved. Salamence earned flight through obsession. Dragonite inherits it through growth and harmony. The difference matters. Salamance's lore also subtly challenges the idea that dreams always lead to happiness. While Salamence achieves what it wants, the result is not peace. It is constant motion, endless flying, unchecked power. In the Pokémon world, this suggests that evolution driven purely by desire can lead to imbalance. Strength without purpose becomes chaos. Freedom without restraint becomes destruction. Yet, Salamence is not portrayed as evil. Its destruction is incidental, not intentional. This nuance makes it tragic rather than villainous. It is not malicious. It is simply too powerful for its surroundings. This tragedy deepens Salamance's character. It is not a monster to be defeated, but a force to be respected and carefully managed. Trainers who bond with Salamence must understand its nature, not suppress it. In many ways, Salamence represents the cost of dreams realized without foresight. It is what happens when ambition outpaces wisdom. The wings that lift it into the sky also isolate it from the ground. Salamance's place among pseudo-legendaries feels earned not because it is the strongest or fastest, but because it embodies a powerful idea. That longing itself can shape evolution. That desire can become destiny. Where Metagross is built, Garchomp is honed, and Hydreigon is unleashed, Salamence is born from yearning, and once it takes flight, it never truly comes down. Goodra stands apart from most pseudo-legendary Pokémon not because of overwhelming aggression or dominance, but because of how gentle it is portrayed to be. In a category usually defined by intimidation, destruction, and raw power, Goodra feels almost out of place. Its presence challenges the assumption that strength must always come paired with hostility, and its lore consistently reinforces the idea that immense power can coexist with softness. One of the most striking things about Goodra is how often its behavior is described in emotional terms rather than combative ones. Pokédex entries emphasize its affectionate nature, noting that it enjoys hugging its trainer and those it trusts. This detail alone sets it apart. Very few Pokemon, especially ones of this power level, are described as actively seeking physical closeness as a sign of bonding. That affection, however, comes with an unusual caveat. Goodra's body is covered in thick, sticky mucus. While it is not malicious, this mucus can be dangerous or uncomfortable to others. This creates an interesting contradiction. Goodra wants to be close, but its very nature makes closeness difficult. In a subtle way, this introduces a theme of isolation born not from fear, but from incompatibility. Goodra's typing reinforces this contrast. As a pure dragon type, it shares a category with creatures often associated with dominance, rage, or ancient power. Yet, its physical form is soft, rounded, and almost vulnerable looking compared to other dragons. It does not have sharp edges or armored plating. Instead, it appears malleable, flexible, and exposed. This design choice is deliberate. Goodra does not rely on intimidation to survive. It relies on endurance and adaptability. Its soft exterior hides remarkable resilience, allowing it to absorb punishment that would cripple more rigid Pokémon. This makes Goodra a quiet tank, rather than an explosive force. Another important aspect of Goodra is its relationship with weather. Many descriptions tie it closely to rain and humidity. Goodra thrives in wet environments, becoming more active and comfortable when surrounded by moisture. When conditions are dry, it becomes lethargic and withdrawn. This dependency adds another layer to Goodra's character. Its strength is conditional. It does not dominate all environments equally. It flourishes only where it can remain comfortable. This stands in contrast to pseudo-legendaries that impose themselves on their surroundings, regardless of conditions. Goodra's evolutionary line reinforces this sensitivity. It begins as a small, fragile creature that is highly dependent on environmental stability. As it evolves, its power grows, but its reliance on moisture remains. Evolution does not eliminate vulnerability, it transforms it. This makes Goodra feel more grounded than many other pseudo-legendaries. Its power does not free it from its needs. It simply allows it to endure longer and protect itself more effectively when those needs are not met. In battle, Goodra often functions as a sponge for damage. It absorbs attacks that would overwhelm others, wearing down opponents through patience rather than aggression. This approach aligns perfectly with its lore. Goodra does not seek conflict, it endures it. There is also a notable sadness in how Goodra's affection is portrayed. Its desire to hug others is described as sincere, but also potentially harmful due to its mucus. This creates a quiet tension. Goodra wants connection, but connection is risky. This theme resonates deeply, especially when compared to pseudo-legendaries that command respect through fear. Goodra earns trust instead. Another interesting detail is how rarely Goodra is portrayed as territorial or domineering. Unlike many dragons that guard hordes or regions, Goodra tends to retreat when threatened rather than escalate immediately. This restraint suggests emotional intelligence rather than weakness. Goodra's strength, then, feels defensive in nature. It exists to protect itself and those it cares about, not to conquer. This makes it particularly interesting in the Pokémon world, where power is often equated with ambition. Its move pool reflects this as well. Goodra has access to many techniques focused on endurance, recovery, and prolonged engagement. It excels in situations where battles are drawn out, where patience becomes an advantage rather than a liability. Another subtle element is how Gudra's design incorporates both mollusk and reptilian traits. This blend reinforces its adaptability. It is neither fully rigid nor fully soft. It exists between states, capable of adjusting its form and behavior based on circumstance. This adaptability mirrors its emotional flexibility. Gudru is gentle, but it is not helpless. When threatened, it can retaliate with devastating force. The difference is intent. Gudra does not enjoy destruction. It uses it only when necessary. In the broader context of pseudo-legendaries, Gudra represents an alternative path to power. It suggests that evolution does not always sharpen edges or harden hearts. Sometimes it simply increases capacity, allowing kindness and resilience to persist at a higher scale. Gudra also subtly challenges player expectations. Trainers who encounter it expecting a traditional dragon may be surprised by its demeanor. This surprise becomes part of its charm. It teaches that appearances, even within established categories, can be misleading. There is also a symbolic reading to be found in Gudru's reliance on rain. Rain often represents renewal, calm, and continuity rather than destruction. Gudra, thriving in rain, reinforces its association with endurance rather than upheaval. Unlike pseudo-legendaries tied to storms, earthquakes, or chaos, Gudra aligns with persistence. It lasts, it survives, it waits. This makes Gudra especially memorable in a genre where spectacle often overshadows subtlety. Its power is not loud, it is constant. Gudra's presence in the Pokémon world broadens the definition of what a powerful Pokémon can be. It proves that dominance is not the only path to relevance. Care, patience, and emotional depth can coexist with immense strength. In many ways, Gudra feels like a response to the more aggressive pseudo-legendaries that came before it. It offers a counterbalance, a reminder that not all legends roar. Some endure quietly, holding together even as the world presses against them. And Gudra, soft and resilient, stands as proof that gentleness can scale just as powerfully as force. Dragonite carries one of the most quietly unusual identities among pseudo-legendary Pokémon, largely because it contradicts expectations at almost every level. On paper, it is a dragon, powerful, rare, and overwhelmingly strong. In practice, it is consistently portrayed as gentle, helpful, and almost disarmingly kind. This contrast is not accidental, and the more closely Dragonite is examined, the clearer it becomes that its true uniqueness lies not in what it can destroy, but in what it chooses not to. One of the earliest things that sets Dragonite apart is how abruptly its evolutionary line changes in tone. Its previous forms are aquatic, serpentine, and almost mythical in their elegance. They live in the ocean, glide through water with ease, and feel closely tied to tides and currents. Then, seemingly without warning, Dragonite emerges as a large, upright, winged creature with a rounded face and soft features. This sudden shift has puzzled fans for years, and while it is often discussed visually, it also carries thematic weight. Dragonite represents transition. It is a Pokémon that leaves the sea behind and takes to the sky, crossing not just environments, but identities. This dual heritage explains many of its unusual traits. It retains the stamina and resilience needed to survive long journeys over water, while gaining the mobility required to traverse vast distances through the air. Pokédex entries describe Dragonite as capable of flying around the world in a short amount of time, enduring harsh weather without rest. This endurance is one of Dragonite's most defining characteristics. While many pseudo-legendaries are described in terms of power output or destructive capability, Dragonite is often described in terms of reliability. It can fly through storms. It can rescue stranded ships. It can carry heavy loads for extended periods. These details frame Dragonite not as a conqueror, but as a responder. In several accounts, Dragonite is said to guide lost travelers or assist those in danger at sea. This helper role is rare among pseudo-legendaries, which are more commonly associated with isolation or dominance. Dragonite, by contrast, is repeatedly depicted as approaching humans willingly and offering aid without provocation. This behavior raises an interesting point about Dragonite's intelligence. Its actions suggest not just awareness, but judgment. It chooses when to intervene. It recognizes distress. It understands intent. These are traits usually attributed to highly social Pokémon rather than solitary powerhouses. Dragonite's typing reinforces this balance. Dragon conveys raw strength and rarity, while flying emphasizes freedom, perspective, and movement. Unlike ground or steel-associated pseudo-legendaries, Dragonite is not tied to territory. It moves constantly. Its domain is the sky itself. Another subtle detail lies in Dragonite's speed. While it is not always presented as the fastest in battle, its travel speed is extraordinary. Some descriptions imply that Dragonite can circle the globe faster than many mechanical vehicles. This suggests an efficiency that goes beyond simple wing strength. Dragonite does not waste energy. It moves with purpose. This efficiency also shows up in battle. Dragonite often relies on consistency rather than flashiness. It endures, hits, recovers, and continues pressing forward. It is difficult to exhaust, both physically and mentally. This makes it a Pokémon that excels in prolonged engagements rather than quick knockouts. Dragonite's emotional portrayal is another area where it stands out. It is often shown smiling, relaxed, or curious. Unlike Pokémon that appear perpetually tense or aggressive, Dragonite seems comfortable in its own strength. It does not need to prove anything. This confidence without arrogance is rare in the Pokémon world. Many powerful Pokémon are framed as tests or threats. Dragonite is framed as a presence, something that exists alongside the world rather than above it. Another interesting element is Dragonite's association with protection rather than dominance. It is often depicted guarding locations, guiding ships, or standing watch over important areas. This reinforces the idea that Dragonite's strength is oriented outward toward others rather than inward. Dragonite's physical design also supports this interpretation. Its rounded features, lack of sharp edges, and expressive face all contribute to a sense of approachability. This is not a creature designed to intimidate at first glance. Its power reveals itself through action, not appearance. Despite this, Dragonite is far from weak. Its raw physical strength is immense, capable of lifting heavy objects and delivering devastating blows when necessary. The difference lies in restraint. Dragonite does not default to violence. It uses force as a tool, not an identity. There's also an interesting contrast between Dragonite and later dragon-type pseudo-legendaries. Many of them emphasize aggression, chaos, or instability. Dragonite feels almost old-fashioned by comparison. Its power is steady, reliable, and calm. This has led some to interpret Dragonite as representing an earlier philosophy of Pokémon design, one that emphasized balance and coexistence over spectacle. Whether intentional or not, Dragonite's characterization feels rooted in that idea. Another lesser-known detail is Dragonite's sensitivity to its surroundings. Despite its strength, it is affected by environmental conditions in subtle ways. Strong winds, extreme cold, and certain atmospheric disturbances can disrupt its flight patterns. This keeps Dragonite grounded within the world's rules rather than elevating it beyond them. Dragonite's role as a pseudo-legendary also carries narrative weight. It often appears at moments where endurance, trust, or guidance are more important than sheer power. This makes it feel less like a final boss and more like a benchmark of maturity. Trainers who work with Dragonite are often portrayed as experienced, patient, and thoughtful. Dragonite does not respond well to recklessness or impatience. It thrives under calm leadership, where decisions are made deliberately rather than impulsively. This dynamic reinforces Dragonite's identity as a partner rather than a weapon. It does not exist to be thrown at problems. It exists to help solve them. Another interesting detail is how Dragonite bridges generations within the Pokémon world. As one of the earliest pseudo-legendaries, it set expectations for what the category could be. Later pseudo-legendaries often respond to or react against Dragonite's design, either by emphasizing greater aggression or more complex mechanics. Dragonite, by contrast, remains simple in concept. Fly far, endure hardship, help when needed. This simplicity is not a flaw, it is a statement. Dragonite also subtly challenges the assumption that power must be intimidating to be respected. Its respect comes from consistency, from always being there when needed, from surviving what others cannot. In this way, Dragonite's legend is built not on fear, but on trust. It is the kind of Pokémon people believe in rather than fear, the kind that inspires confidence rather than caution. And in a world filled with storms, monsters, and chaos, that may be the rarest form of power of all. Tyranitar is one of the most imposing Pokémon ever created, not because it seeks attention, but because the world seems to change around it simply by existing. From the moment it appears, Tyranitar is framed less like an animal and more like a walking natural disaster. Its presence is associated with collapsing terrain, shifting landscapes, and environments that never quite recover the same way again. One of the most overlooked aspects of Tyranitar is how long it takes to reach its final form. Its evolutionary line emphasizes patience and isolation. The middle stage is described as sealing itself away inside a hardened shell, remaining motionless for extended periods while it gathers energy. During this time, it is effectively cut off from the outside world. This extended isolation suggests that Tyranitar is not a creature shaped by interaction, but by endurance. When Tyranitar finally emerges, it does so fully formed and immediately dominant. There is no adjustment period, no learning curve. Pokédex descriptions often imply that Tyranitar does not need to test its strength. It knows it already surpasses almost everything around it. Tyranitar's relationship with the environment is especially telling. Rather than adapting to its surroundings, Tyranitar reshapes them. Mountains crumble, rivers change course. Entire landscapes are altered simply by its movement. This behavior is not described as accidental. It is treated as a natural consequence of Tyranitar existing at full strength. Its typing reinforces this identity. Rock suggests permanence, pressure, and geological time. Dark adds an element of intimidation and moral ambiguity. Together, they create a Pokémon that feels less like a living being and more like an event. Another subtle detail lies in Tyranitar's posture. It stands upright. Unlike many reptilian Pokémon that lean forward, this posture gives it a towering silhouette, emphasizing its dominance. It does not crouch or stalk, it advances openly. Tyranitar's armor-like hide is another defining trait. Its body is covered in thick, jagged plating that appears almost fused together. This armor is not decorative. It is repeatedly described as being nearly impervious to damage. Attacks that would devastate other Pokémon often barely register against it. Despite this, Tyranitar is not slow. While it is not built for agility, its movement is deliberate and unstoppable. It does not dodge, it absorbs and continues forward. This creates a sense of inevitability in battle. Once Tyranitar commits, stopping it becomes a matter of attrition rather than technique. One interesting aspect of Tyranitar's behavior is its apparent indifference to threats. Many descriptions suggest that it does not react unless directly challenged. It does not patrol territory aggressively or hunt indiscriminately. It simply exists, and the world reacts accordingly. This indifference makes Tyranitar feel less like a predator and more like a force of nature. Earthquakes do not pursue prey. Storms do not seek targets. Tyranitar operates on a similar scale. Tyranitar's connection to sandstorms is another key detail. Its mere presence can trigger violent weather conditions, filling the air with sand and debris. These storms are not tactical choices. They are passive effects, reinforcing the idea that Tyranitar's power radiates outward without effort. This passive dominance makes Tyranitar especially dangerous. It does not need to act to gain an advantage. Simply remaining on the battlefield tilts conditions in its favor. There is also an interesting contradiction in Tyranitar's evolutionary narrative. While its final form is associated with destruction, its earlier stages are fragile and cautious. The cocoon phase suggests vulnerability, patience, and waiting. This implies that Tyranitar's eventual dominance is not innate, but earned through survival. This long developmental period also suggests rarity. Tyranitar is not common, because few survive the process required to become one. This makes its presence feel meaningful whenever it appears. Another detail often missed is how Tyranitar interacts with other powerful Pokémon. It is rarely depicted as subservient or reactive. Even among other pseudo-legendaries, Tyranitar holds its ground. It does not retreat easily, and when it does, it is often described as choosing to leave rather than being forced out. Tyranitar's design subtly supports this. Its facial expression is neutral but stern, giving the impression of constant focus. It does not snarl or roar excessively. Its confidence is silent. In battle, Tyranitar's strength lies in pressure. It wears opponents down through sustained force and environmental control. This makes encounters with it feel exhausting rather than explosive. Victory, if achieved, feels earned. Another lesser-known detail is how Tyranitar is described as being unaffected by pain in the traditional sense. Some entries suggest it simply ignores damage unless it threatens functionality. This reinforces the idea that Tyranitar operates on a different scale of concern. Tyranitar's weaknesses are interesting because they exploit specific structural gaps rather than general frailty. When struck effectively, it suffers dramatically, reinforcing that its power is immense but not absolute. This balance prevents Tyranitar from becoming invincible while maintaining its mythic weight. There is also a thematic connection between Tyranitar and human ambition. It is sometimes described as destroying mountains to make its home, suggesting a disregard for existing structures. This mirrors how unchecked power can reshape worlds, without concern for what was there before. Yet, Tyranitar is not framed as malicious. It does not destroy out of cruelty. It destroys because it can. This neutrality makes it more unsettling than a villain. Trainers who work with Tyranitar are often portrayed as commanding respect rather than affection. Tyranitar does not bond easily. Trust must be earned, and even then, it maintains independence. This reinforces Tyranitar's identity as something closer to a sovereign than a companion. It is not owned, it is allied. Among pseudo-legendaries, Tyranitar represents permanence. It does not rush, it does not chase trends. It stands, and the world shifts around it. Its legend is not about speed, intelligence, or chaos. It is about inevitability. When Tyranitar appears, change follows. Not because it intends to change things, but because resisting it is rarely an option. And once it moves on, the land it leaves behind never quite looks the same. Kommo-o is one of the most culturally specific, pseudo-legendary Pokémon, and much of what makes it interesting comes from how deeply its identity is tied to ritual, discipline, and sound rather than sheer spectacle. While many pseudo-legendaries are defined by overwhelming presence or raw aggression, Kommo-o is defined by structure. Everything about it suggests training, tradition, and a life shaped by deliberate practice rather than instinct alone. At first glance, Kommo-o appears heavily armored. Its body is covered in overlapping scales that resemble plates, giving it the appearance of a warrior clad in ceremonial gear. These scales are not just for protection. They play an active role in how Kommo-o interacts with the world. The scales along its body can clash together, producing loud metallic sounds that are central to its behavior, communication, and combat style. This use of sound is one of Kommo-o's most distinctive traits. Rather than roaring or relying purely on visual intimidation, Kommo-o announces itself through rhythmic clanging. These sounds are not random. They are described as purposeful, sometimes used to challenge opponents, sometimes to signal readiness, and sometimes to assert dominance without physical confrontation. In this way, Kommo behaves more like a martial artist than a beast. Kommo-o's dragon and fighting typing reinforces this identity. Dragon represents power and rarity, while fighting emphasizes discipline, training, and technique. Together, they create a Pokémon whose strength feels earned through effort rather than granted by nature. Kommo-o does not rely on brute force alone. It relies on form, timing, and control. One lesser-known detail is how Kommo-o's scales develop over time. As it grows and evolves, these scales harden and multiply, but they also become heavier. This added weight increases its defensive capabilities, but requires constant physical conditioning to manage. Kommo-o that fail to maintain their strength reportedly lose mobility, making discipline not just a cultural choice, but a necessity for survival. Kommo-o's evolutionary line reflects this progression clearly. Its earliest form is small and relatively unassuming, lacking the heavy armor that defines its final stage. As it evolves, its body becomes more encumbered, demanding greater strength and control to move effectively. This mirrors real-world training philosophies, where increased equipment and responsibility require increased discipline. Another interesting aspect of Kommo-o is its territorial behavior. Unlike Pokémon that aggressively defend vast areas, Kommo-o tends to establish controlled zones where it trains and tests challengers. These areas often show signs of repeated impact, cracked stone, and worn ground, suggesting that Kommo-o uses its environment as part of its training regimen. When a challenger approaches, Kommo-o does not always attack immediately. Instead, it may produce loud, rhythmic clanging sounds by striking its scales together. This serves as both a warning and an invitation. Those who retreat are spared, those who remain are tested. This behavior suggests that Komodo values strength, but not indiscriminately. It does not hunt weaker creatures for sport. It seeks worthy opposition, reinforcing its image as a warrior bound by code rather than chaos. Komodo's battles are often described as intense but structured. It does not flail or rush recklessly. Its movements are deliberate, grounded, and precise. This precision is reflected in its ability to execute powerful techniques that rely on timing rather than raw speed. Another obscure detail lies in Komodo's sensitivity to its own scales. While they provide protection, they also amplify sound. Loud noises can disorient it, and certain sonic attacks are particularly effective against it. This vulnerability adds balance to its design and reinforces the idea that its strength comes with trade-offs. This sensitivity also suggests that Komodo's environment matters greatly. It thrives in areas where sound carries clearly and predictably, such as open plains or rocky regions. Chaotic or echo-heavy environments may disrupt its ability to read auditory cues, reducing its effectiveness. Komodo's social behavior is also worth noting. While it is often solitary, encounters between Komodo are described as ritualistic rather than immediately violent. They may circle each other, clash scales rhythmically, and assess one another before engaging. This suggests a hierarchy maintained through respect rather than constant conflict. Another detail often overlooked is Komodo's relationship with endurance. While not the fastest pseudo-legendary, it compensates through stamina. Komodo can sustain intense physical output for long periods, outlasting opponents who rely on quick bursts of power. This endurance aligns with its training-focused identity. Its design also subtly incorporates influences from traditional armor and martial attire, giving it a ceremonial appearance. This visual language reinforces the idea that Komodo is not just a fighter, but a practitioner of a long-standing tradition passed down through generations. Komodo's weaknesses further highlight its grounded nature. Certain types exploit gaps in its armor or disrupt its rhythm, forcing it out of its controlled combat style. This reinforces the idea that Komodo's strength depends heavily on maintaining balance and structure. There is also a thematic contrast between Komodo and more chaotic pseudo-legendaries. Where others overwhelm through unpredictability, Komodo overwhelms through consistency. It does the same thing repeatedly, perfectly, until opponents can no longer keep up. In the Pokémon world, this makes Komodo feel ancient, not because of age, but because of tradition. It represents a lineage of technique refined over time, where each generation builds upon the last. Komodo's presence challenges the idea that power must be explosive to be legendary. Its strength is steady, measured, and intentional. It is a reminder that mastery often looks quiet until it is tested. For trainers, working with Komodo requires patience and respect. It does not respond well to reckless commands or improvisation. It thrives under structured guidance, where expectations are clear and consistent. This dynamic reinforces Komodo's identity as a partner rather than a tool. Success with it comes from understanding its rhythm, not forcing your own. Komodo ultimately represents a different philosophy of strength within the Pokémon world. It shows that discipline, ritual, and restraint can elevate power just as effectively as raw aggression. It does not seek to dominate everything around it. It seeks to perfect itself. And in doing so, Komodo stands as a quiet testament to the idea that true strength is not just about how hard you strike, but how well you control every movement leading up to it. Dragapult occupies a very different psychological space among pseudo-legendary Pokémon, where others impose themselves through mass, endurance, or overwhelming force. Dragapult is defined by absence. It is not the threat you see approaching. It is the pressure you feel when something has already passed through the battlefield before you understand what moved. At first glance, Dragapult's design feels almost understated. Its body is long and narrow, with smooth lines and minimal ornamentation. There is no heavy armor, no exaggerated musculature, no sense of weight pressing it into the environment. Instead, everything about Dragapult suggests lightness and momentum. It looks less like a creature bound by gravity and more like a phenomenon temporarily choosing to exist in physical space. This impression is intentional. Dragapult is consistently described as moving at extreme speeds, often beyond what the eye can follow. Unlike Pokémon that accelerate visibly or telegraph their attacks, Dragapult's movement is described as sudden and silent. It does not announce itself. It appears, acts, and disappears before most opponents can orient themselves. Speed alone, however, does not fully explain Dragapult's identity. Many Pokémon are fast. What sets Dragapult apart is how its speed is paired with intangibility. As a dragon and ghost type, Dragapult exists partially outside conventional physical constraints. This dual typing is not just a mechanical detail. It defines how Dragapult interacts with the world. Dragon types are typically framed as dominant forces, creatures that command territory through power and presence. Ghost types, by contrast, are associated with ambiguity, dislocation, and unease. Dragapult merges these traits into something unusual. It is a dominant predator that does not need to assert control through confrontation. It overwhelms through inevitability rather than intimidation. This becomes especially clear when examining Dragapult's behavior. It is described as roaming skies and seas at incredible speeds, rarely staying in one place for long. Unlike Pokémon that establish clear habitats or territories, Dragapult feels transient. It does not settle. It passes through environments rather than inhabiting them. This transience gives Dragapult a ghostly quality beyond its typing. It feels less like a resident of the world and more like a force that intersects with it briefly. Encounters with Dragapult are not prolonged. They are moments. A sudden presence, a blur, and then absence. One of the most striking aspects of Dragapult is its relationship with Dreepy. The small Pokémon that rest in the launchers on its head are not passengers in the traditional sense. They are integral to Dragapult's identity. Dragapult does not simply tolerate their presence. It actively incorporates them into its behavior and combat style. This relationship is often misunderstood as whimsical or playful, but it carries deeper implications. Dragapult launches Dreepy at extreme speeds as a form of attack, yet the Dreepy are described as enjoying this process. They return unharmed, seemingly exhilarated rather than distressed. This suggests a level of trust and coordination that goes beyond simple instinct. Rather than exploiting weaker Pokémon, Dragapult functions as a protector and facilitator. The Dreepy gain experiences they could not achieve on their own, while Dragapult gains versatility and reach. This symbiotic relationship adds an unexpected layer of complexity to Dragapult's otherwise solitary demeanor. Despite this cooperative element, Dragapult itself remains emotionally distant. It is not described as affectionate or expressive. Its interactions are efficient and purposeful. The bond with Dreepy feels less like companionship and more like alignment of roles. Each exists in a system that benefits from precision and speed. Dragapult's evolutionary line reinforces this theme of gradual refinement. Starting from Dreepy, a small and fragile Pokémon, the line progresses through Dracloak before reaching Dragapult. Each stage adds speed, control, and autonomy. There is no sudden transformation into dominance. Instead, the line emphasizes learning how to move faster, farther, and more decisively. Dracloak, in particular, provides insight into Dragapult's psychology. It is described as caring deeply for Dreepy, becoming distressed if they are absent. This suggests that the emotional connection is strongest before full evolution. By the time Dragapult emerges, that attachment has transformed into function. Concern becomes coordination, protection becomes integration. This transition mirrors Dragapult's broader theme. Emotional intensity gives way to efficiency, vulnerability gives way to motion. What remains is not coldness, but focus. Another defining trait of Dragapult is its silence. Many fast Pokémon are loud, generating wind, shockwaves, or visual distortions as they move. Dragapult, by contrast, is often described as nearly soundless. Its passage is subtle. By the time sound arrives, the movement is already over. This silence contributes to Dragapult's psychological impact in battle. Opponents cannot rely on auditory cues to react. There is no warning growl, no buildup of energy. Attacks feel instantaneous, as if reality itself skipped a step. Dragapult's attacks often reinforce this sensation. Rather than dramatic displays of power, they are precise and sudden. Even its more forceful techniques feel like extensions of motion rather than separate actions. Everything flows from speed. Despite this emphasis on velocity, Dragapult is not fragile. While its defenses are not built around heavy armor or raw endurance, its evasiveness compensates for this. It avoids damage rather than absorbing it. This creates a different kind of durability, one rooted in denial rather than resistance. In this way, Dragapult represents a different survival philosophy than many pseudo-legendaries. It does not endure hardship. It avoids it. It does not dominate through presence. It dominates through elusiveness. There is also an unsettling element to how Dragapult interacts with space. As a ghost type, it is capable of phasing through objects and terrain. This ability removes traditional barriers. Walls, obstacles, and fortifications lose meaning. Distance becomes irrelevant when nothing truly blocks movement. This ability changes how opponents must think. Defensive positioning becomes unreliable. Safe zones no longer exist. The battlefield feels porous, as if threats can emerge from anywhere. Dragapult's connection to ancient species adds another layer to its identity. It is described as a revival of an ancient Pokémon that lived in prehistoric seas. This ties Dragapult to deep time, but in a way that feels inverted. Rather than being a relic of the past, Dragapult feels like a concept rediscovered and optimized. This is important. Dragapult is not ancient in the mythic sense. It is ancient in design philosophy. It represents a form that evolution once favored, abandoned, and then refined again. This gives it an almost experimental quality, as if nature revisited an old idea with new priorities. Unlike many pseudo-legendaries that feel tied to legends or singular historical events, Dragapult feels timeless. It does not belong to a specific era. Its relevance does not depend on myth. It depends on performance. Another often overlooked aspect of Dragapult is its emotional neutrality. It is not described as cruel, benevolent, or wrathful. It acts. This neutrality makes its actions harder to interpret and predict. There is no clear emotional trigger to exploit. This emotional opacity reinforces Dragapult's ghostly nature. Ghosts are unsettling, not because they are aggressive, but because their intentions are unclear. Dragapult embodies this ambiguity. It does not posture, it does not threaten, it simply moves. In battle, Dragapult's presence compresses decision-making. Opponents are forced to react instantly, often without complete information. Mistakes happen not because of poor planning, but because there is no time to plan at all. This creates a unique form of pressure. Facing Dragapult is not about endurance or strength. It is about perception and timing. Can you see it before it acts? Can you respond before it moves again? Dragapult's reputation reflects this. It is not feared for catastrophic destruction, but for inevitability. Once it commits, outcomes feel predetermined. Not because Dragapult is unstoppable, but because it controls the pace of engagement. There is also a subtle elegance to Dragapult's design. Its smooth body, flowing tail, and balanced proportions create a sense of harmony. Nothing feels excessive. Every element appears optimized for movement. Even the placement of the dreepy launchers feels deliberate. They do not disrupt Dragapult's aerodynamics. They integrate seamlessly into its silhouette. This reinforces the idea that Dragapult is not burdened by what it carries. It incorporates it. Dragapult's ghost typing also introduces themes of memory and absence. Ghost Pokémon are often linked to remnants of the past, lost spirits, or unfinished stories. Dragapult's lore hints at extinction and revival, suggesting that it carries echoes of what once was. Yet Dragapult does not dwell on these echoes. It does not linger or haunt. It moves forward, literally and figuratively. The past informs its existence, but does not define its behavior. This forward motion is central to Dragapult's identity. It is always moving, always transitioning. Even when stationary, it feels temporary, as if stopping is a choice rather than a necessity. Dragapult's interactions with trainers further emphasize this. It is not easily domesticated in the traditional sense. It requires trust, understanding, and respect for its autonomy. Attempts to restrain or overly control Dragapult often fail, as its nature resists confinement. When properly aligned with a trainer, however, Dragapult becomes exceptionally responsive, not because it follows orders blindly, but because it understands timing and intent. Communication feels implicit rather than explicit. This implicit understanding mirrors Dragapult's broader theme of efficiency. Words are unnecessary when motion suffices. Signals are unnecessary when patterns are understood. Another important detail is how Dragapult contrasts with bulkier pseudo-legendaries, where others occupy space and force opponents to deal with their presence. Dragapult minimizes its footprint. It exists where it needs to, when it needs to, and nowhere else. This minimalism extends to its combat philosophy. Dragapult does not overwhelm with repeated attacks. It strikes where it matters, then disengages. Battles feel surgical rather than chaotic. This precision contributes to Dragapult's suitability for prolonged engagements. While it may not finish every fight instantly, it controls attrition through positioning and timing. It decides when exchanges happen and when they end. Dragapult's weaknesses, like those of all Pokémon, are real, but exploiting them requires anticipation rather than reaction. This shifts the burden onto the opponent. Preparation becomes essential. Improvisation becomes risky. There is also an emotional tension inherent in Dragapult's use of Dreepy as projectiles. While described as enjoyable for the Dreepy, the imagery is unsettling. Small beings, launched at extreme speeds, evoke vulnerability, even if harm does not occur. This tension adds complexity to Dragapult's otherwise clean efficiency. It reminds us that optimization often involves trade-offs, even when all participants benefit. Comfort is secondary to function. In the broader Pokémon ecosystem, Dragapult represents a future-oriented pseudo-legendary. It is not defined by legacy, prophecy, or ancient power. It is defined by adaptability and speed in a world that rewards both. As environments become more complex and threats more unpredictable, Dragapult's ability to traverse, evade, and respond instantly becomes increasingly valuable. It is not a guardian of tradition. It is a solution to modern challenges. When Dragapult enters a battlefield, the atmosphere changes subtly, not through intimidation, but through uncertainty. Lines blur, distances collapse, movement becomes unreliable. Opponents find themselves reacting to after-images rather than actions. Decisions feel late the moment they are made. Dragapult does not demand attention. Baxcalibur represents a return to weight, pressure, and inevitability among pseudo-legendary Pokémon, but not in the way most expect. Where many powerful Pokémon rely on spectacle or overwhelming scale, Baxcalibur asserts itself through persistence. It does not overwhelm instantly. It advances, endures, and refuses to yield. Its threat is not sudden, it is constant. At first glance, Baxcalibur's design feels deliberately heavy. Its upright posture, thick limbs, and broad torso communicate mass before motion. This is a Pokémon that occupies space decisively. It does not glide or dart. It plants itself into the environment as if the world must accommodate its presence rather than the other way around. Unlike pseudo-legendaries built around speed or versatility, Baxcalibur is framed through resistance. Cold, terrain, and impact are not obstacles, they are conditions it expects. Its ice and dragon typing immediately establishes this philosophy. Ice types are often associated with fragility or situational power, but Baxcalibur reinterprets ice as endurance rather than delicacy. This is ice that does not crack, it compresses. Dragon typing reinforces this identity. Dragons in the Pokémon world often symbolize dominance, but Baxcalibur's dominance is not expressed through elegance or ferocity. It is expressed through survival. It is not the apex predator because it is the fastest or the most intelligent. It is the apex predator because nothing can remove it once it arrives. Baxcalibur's body design supports this interpretation. Its thick, armored hide and jagged ice formations are not ornamental. They are functional layers of protection. The ice that coats its back and limbs acts as both armor and weapon, turning its own body into a hazard. Physical contact becomes costly, even when Baxcalibur is not attacking. This creates a unique form of pressure in battle. Opponents are punished simply for engaging. Trading blows becomes inefficient. Retreat becomes difficult. Baxcalibur thrives in drawn-out confrontations where its durability erodes the opponent's options. One of the most important aspects of Baxcalibur's identity is its relationship with cold environments. Rather than merely tolerating extreme cold, Baxcalibur is described as actively generating and sustaining it. Snowfields and frozen landscapes are not neutral ground. They are extensions of Baxcalibur's presence. This environmental influence changes how battles unfold. Reduced mobility, limited visibility, and numbing cold all favor Baxcalibur's approach. It moves deliberately through conditions that slow or disorient others. Each step forward feels earned and inevitable. Baxcalibur's evolutionary line emphasizes this progression toward inevitability. Frigibax begins as something fragile, dependent on external protection. Arctibax introduces resilience, developing armor like ice along its body. By the time Baxcalibur emerges, that armor has become fully integrated. Defense is no longer reactive, it is intrinsic. This gradual reinforcement tells a clear story. Baxcalibur is not born dominant. It becomes dominant through adaptation. Each stage adds not speed or aggression, but structural integrity. The line does not refine technique. It fortifies presence. Unlike pseudo-legendaries that feel refined or optimized, Baxcalibur feels engineered for survival in hostile conditions. It is less a specialist and more a generalist built for extremes. Heat, pressure, and force do not easily deter it. This makes Baxcalibur particularly unsettling in its simplicity. There is no trick to understand, no gimmick to counter. It advances. It endures. It overwhelms through attrition. Another key detail is Baxcalibur's posture. Standing upright, it resembles classic depictions of prehistoric predators. This silhouette evokes power rooted in raw physicality rather than strategy. Baxcalibur does not rely on angles or misdirection. It confronts threats directly. This directness is reflected in its behavior. Baxcalibur is described as aggressive, but not reckless. It does not charge blindly. It advances with confidence, trusting its own durability to absorb retaliation. This confidence comes not from arrogance, but from experience. Baxcalibur has survived enough to know what it can endure. In combat, Baxcalibur's attacks feel heavy. Even when using ice-type techniques, the emphasis is on force rather than finesse. Blows land with weight. Impacts linger. Damage accumulates rather than spikes. This creates a different rhythm than speed-focused pseudo-legendaries. Battles involving Baxcalibur feel slower, but more oppressive. Each exchange shifts momentum further in its favor. Time becomes an ally rather than a constraint. Baxcalibur's dragon typing also contributes to its psychological impact. Dragons are often associated with intelligence or mythic presence, but Baxcalibur's dragon identity feels primal. It is not ancient in the legendary sense. It is ancient in the biological sense. It feels like a creature that would have existed long before modern ecosystems stabilized. A survivor from an era where endurance mattered more than efficiency. This prehistoric impression is reinforced by Baxcalibur's connection to glacial environments. Ice ages are defined by scarcity, cold, and pressure. Baxcalibur feels like a product of those conditions. It does not dominate because the world favors it. It dominates because it endures when the world becomes hostile. Another important aspect of Baxcalibur is how it handles pain. While Pokémon battles abstract injury, Baxcalibur's lore implies a high tolerance for damage. It does not retreat at the first sign of harm. It absorbs punishment, using its armored body to mitigate impact while continuing forward. This tolerance changes how opponents must approach it. Burst damage becomes unreliable. Gradual wear-down strategies become risky. Baxcalibur excels at turning extended engagements into victories through sheer persistence. There is also a notable absence of elegance in Baxcalibur's design. Unlike sleek pseudo-legendaries that convey speed or intelligence, Baxcalibur is blunt. Its edges are jagged. Its proportions are heavy. This lack of refinement is intentional. Baxcalibur does not need to look graceful. Its threat does not depend on aesthetics. It depends on inevitability. This bluntness extends to its emotional portrayal. Baxcalibur is not depicted as cunning or strategic. It does not manipulate or outthink. It applies pressure until resistance collapses. This makes it easier to understand, but harder to stop. Baxcalibur's ice typing also recontextualizes how cold is portrayed in the Pokémon world. Cold is often associated with stasis or fragility, but Baxcalibur represents cold as force. Ice becomes a medium of impact, a way to add mass and density to attacks. This interpretation aligns with Baxcalibur's physicality. Ice reinforces its body rather than encumbering it. Cold does not slow Baxcalibur, it strengthens it. In this way, Baxcalibur contrasts sharply with pseudo-legendaries like Dragapult. Where Dragapult avoids damage through speed and intangibility, Baxcalibur accepts damage as part of engagement. It does not evade, it endures. This difference highlights the diversity within pseudo-legendaries. Power does not manifest in a single form. Baxcalibur represents power through resistance rather than control. Another subtle detail lies in how Baxcalibur's presence affects morale. Facing it is psychologically draining. Each failed attempt to push it back reinforces the sense that effort is being wasted. Opponents begin to doubt whether progress is possible at all. This erosion of confidence is one of Baxcalibur's most effective weapons. It does not need to intimidate, it simply outlasts. Baxcalibur's movements also reinforce this psychological pressure. It does not rush, it does not hesitate. Its pace is steady and deliberate. Each step forward communicates certainty. This certainty contrasts with Pokémon that rely on sudden bursts or calculated timing. Baxcalibur does not wait for openings. It creates them by advancing until resistance breaks. There is also an environmental storytelling element to Baxcalibur. Its association with frozen landscapes suggests isolation. These are not crowded ecosystems. They are sparse, unforgiving places where only the strongest persist. Baxcalibur feels like the dominant force in such environments, not because it controls them, but because it survives them. Other Pokémon adapt temporarily. Baxcalibur belongs. This sense of belonging adds to its threat. Baxcalibur is not an intruder, it is at home. Opponents are the ones out of place. Baxcalibur's weaknesses exist, but they are not easily exploited. They require deliberate preparation rather than reactive play. This reinforces Baxcalibur's role as a test of endurance rather than reflex. Trainers facing Baxcalibur must commit fully. Half measures fail. Hesitation is punished. The battle becomes a question of resolve rather than technique. This emphasis on resolve makes Baxcalibur thematically distinct. It is not a puzzle to solve, it is a wall to break. Even among other pseudo-legendaries, Baxcalibur stands out for how unapologetically physical it is. It does not lean on special abilities or unique mechanics. It leans on mass, armor, and pressure. This simplicity makes Baxcalibur feel honest. Its strength is visible. Its threat is obvious. There are no surprises, only consequences. Yet despite this apparent straightforwardness, Baxcalibur is not easy to handle. Knowing what it will do does not make stopping it easier. Predictability does not equate to vulnerability. This is perhaps Baxcalibur's most unsettling trait. It does not need unpredictability. Its consistency is enough. In the broader Pokemon world, Baxcalibur represents a form of power rooted in environmental adaptation rather than legend. It is not revered because of myth, it is respected because of survival. It does not symbolize balance or wisdom, it symbolizes persistence. When Baxcalibur enters a battlefield, the tone shifts differently than with faster pseudo legendaries. There is no sudden tension spike. Instead, a slow realization sets in.